program at the Institute for Latino Studies at the University of Notre Dame. The date is October 30th, 2007. We are in room number 208 in McKenna Hall on the University of Notre Dame campus. The interviewer will be Orlando Ricardo Menés, Associate Professor in the Department of English. I will be interviewing Valerie Martinez. Thank you, Valerie Martinez, for participating in our oral history program. Would you please state your full name, date, and place of birth?
My name is Valerie Martinez. I was born June 26, 1961 in Santa Fe, New Mexico.
Thank you for giving us that information. My first question springs from that information that you just gave us. We know where you were born, but I would like to know some more about that fact of your life. And this is my question. Could you speak about where you are from and where you grew up and how these have influenced your work as a poet?
Yes, well, I was born in Santa Fe, and my family has been there for over 400 years. I'm part Navajo and mostly Hispanic, and so I'm mestiza. There are probably a lot of other things mixed in there. According to our family genealogists, my ancestors on my father's side came from Spain in 1598, and they were part of the first group of Spanish settlers that came to Mexico and North America and moved quickly north into New Mexico, and were there sort of since about the early 1600s on that side. They fled during the Pueblo Revolt of 1680 and then returned to Santa Fe. My mother's side of the family traced their roots to the Spaniards in about 1630, coming to the New World. And I have a great-great-grandmother on my father's side who's Navajo, so I have North American Indian blood, though I didn't grow up on the reservation or anything like that. I know only about that culture from learning about it. So my family has been sort of in the place where I live now. I left Santa Fe for a long time but moved back in 2003. But my family has been on the same sort of, in the same place for that long. And so I grew up in the 60s. I was born in 61, and so a child of 50s parents. There were 6 of us born in 6 years. My mother had the first one when she was 19, and the last of us when she was 25 years old. My father's a little bit older. And we grew up, you know, sort of both American and Hispanic, as you call it in northern New Mexico, or Latino. So we sort of participated in all the celebrations and rituals of Hispanic culture. We went to, I was raised as a Catholic and went to Mass and a lot of Catholic weddings, and learned, we had, you know, sort of ate food native to New Mexico rather than Spain. And my parents spoke Spanish and English in our home until we were about 5. And then at that point, as it was in those days, the teachers urged them to speak only English in our home because they thought we wouldn't do well in school. And so my parents, when we were very young, started speaking only English at home. So I have an understanding of Spanish. I understand Spanish, but I can't speak it fluently, but I do write in English and Spanish, sometimes mostly English. And I guess the biggest influence on my work, I suppose, this is a big subject for me because my writing has been considered different than a lot of Latino poets because often it doesn't address sort of my cultural background topically. A lot of Latino poetry in the second half of the 20th century, I think, became sort of stereotyped, and people identified it as Latino because the poems sort of topically are about their neighborhood or going to Mass and things like that. And I think the way my culture influenced my work has to do spiritually, the presence of the the dead in my work. I think that comes from a sense of my ancestors being around all of the time. And so I also had trauma as a young child, and to kind of deal with that trauma, I escaped into imaginary worlds, and that was another strong influence on my work. So I was a daydreamer. I had a very troubled child and adolescence, and I did well in school, but I really just didn't want to be in the world very much. And so my poems are very much imaginary landscapes. I envy poets who can write sort of about the kitchen sink or the kitchen table, but for various reasons, the worlds of my poems are imaginary worlds. They're sparked by things in this world, whether it's news articles or political situations. And so my first two books, I should say that my first two books, a lot of those poems are imagined landscapes and places. So to answer the question, I guess the influence of my childhood and where I grew up had to do, I believe, with a kind of spiritual reality that was that I learned about or grew up with, and then a kind of escape into other places, and that's what informs my work. Now, my third book, which is the book I'm going to read from tonight, is quite different, and it has as its spark the murders of the now 420 murders of women in Juarez. And so this is my first book that in some ways tries to grapple with a real situation that has been, that I've been really obsessed with for about the last 2 or 3 years.
Your answer presented a great deal of information for me that I didn't know. Would you care to elaborate on the trauma that has created, apparently, the creative tension that has compelled you to write poetry?
Yes, I was molested when I was 7 years old by a stranger, and it happened outside my house, really, which is a curious thing because I grew up where all the children in the neighborhood were always outside and playing, and there were a lot of kids around. And for whatever reason on this afternoon, I was the only one out in the front on my bike. And so that was, and I survived that, and luckily, I think these days, perhaps I wouldn't have survived it in the same way. In those days, I think, sort of pedophiles were able to kind of escape and have some sort of safety. They never found this person, and so what happened to me is I think it just went underground. My parents dealt with it and took care of me physically, but there wasn't, people didn't go into therapy in those days. And so my parents took the approach that if we never talked about it, that I wouldn't feel, that maybe I would either forget or just, I don't know. I mean, they just didn't know how to handle it. I think my father felt helpless. It was a terrible thing for him. He wasn't there to help me, and my mother just tried to take care of as much as possible. And so I was very young, obviously, and so I think it just went underground. I started writing when I was 13, and that's when I started to have very severe kind of psychological problems. I was a very good student, but I just was emotionally sort of a wreck, and I think it was buried, and about 13 years old it sort of rose up, and that's when I started writing. And writing became a refuge for me. It was a place, I never wrote about the trauma. In fact, I never even started to deal with the trauma or reported it to a therapist until I was about 22 years old. So I think in some ways, consciously I forgot, but subconsciously it was buried there. And so I started writing in a journal, and I started writing poems, and they were very dark. I seemed to be very concerned with what was happening elsewhere in the world, with political events and wars. The Vietnam War in some ways came up again, even though it was a little bit later. That was already in the early 70s. And I lost all those journals a few years ago in a house fire, where I lost everything. So in a way, I only remember them sort of vaguely, but I had kept all those journals. And so what it meant is that I actually, out of that, somehow built a creative life psychologically. And so I would write about real events in my journal, but the poems were mostly imagined worlds. They weren't, cheerful necessarily. They weren't tragic. They were just other worlds. And actually, for those who are survivors of sexual trauma, what's interesting is I think if you do your work, then in some ways, something that was so terrible ends up being something, can end up being something very positive in one's life. So writing for me actually did save my life, because I had a place to go that was not real and that was stirred the imagination, and it helped me survive. So writing for me is not just almost even a creative act, it's a healing act, and sort of got me through those years, even though I wouldn't say that the poems were, sort of the most delightful things. They were never really pretty pictures, but they also weren't awful stories. They were just a place to go. And so also my work has concerned in important ways over the years women's issues and women's bodies, and that makes a lot of sense because of what happened to me.
And your answer is I thank you for sharing this experience with us and for having the courage to do that. It means a great deal to me. And your answer as well makes clear to the listeners that working with language through the imagination allows for the integration of the unconscious and the conscious mind. And the healing takes place with that integration. And not necessarily because one is narrating the event, but actually working through the emotions of the event through language rather than the event itself through a narrative.
Yes, I agree. And it's an unconscious, and it just occurred to me as you're talking that even the kind of what people have called spiritual aspects of the poems, this concern from the about the dead, may also come from the idea of having I was resurrected in a way myself from a kind of death back into the world, but it took me a long, long time. So I think in part, perhaps that concern with that is the story of that kind of healing or resurrection from trauma. And so, but I also want to say that, what's so odd about it to me now, thinking about it, is perhaps I would not be a poet if it hadn't happened to me. I'd like to think that I was born to be a poet and it would have happened anyway, but there's always that question for me. Of course that doesn't mean it was a good thing. It just means that it was, in some ways, it allowed me to do the work that I do. If I hadn't survived the trauma, if I hadn't gotten the help that I started to get when I was 20, many, many years later, I really wouldn't be around now. But it's possible that, in fact, that event, a pivotal point in my life, enabled me more powerfully to have a creative life, or perhaps enabled me to have a creative life at all. It's a hard thing to think that, because we wouldn't want anyone to have to become a poet for that reason. But in my life, perhaps that's just what happened, and so it's just a reality.
Certainly, some people write poetry out of the sheer pleasure or joy of making a poem, and then there are others who not only experience what I just mentioned, but also have a necessity, a spiritual, emotional necessity to write about their lives, however they want to write about their lives. I will say that after having read your poetry, that even though the poems that I've read are not necessarily bicultural topically, they do locate cultures through language. And language itself can be a source of location in writing. And in fact, in Jesuit meditation, the sense of place that begins a Jesuit meditation is the place in the Bible that engenders the meditation. So place can certainly be scriptural or just textual.
I think that's a really wonderful point because it's a question or a topic that's very interesting to me right now, which is where does culture reside in language? And because I often now am invited to read with younger poets, you know, been included in an anthology called Junta, which is what people are calling avant-garde Latino poetry. And it's so interesting to me that my work would be considered avant-garde. The reason why it is because, again, Latino poetry in the second half of the 20th century, and these were publishers' choices. The poems that got published the most were topical, were about one's neighborhood, or they were political statements about being Latino or Hispanic or mestizo or whatever. And what's happening now, which is a wonderful thing, is that the field of Latino poetry is opening up to include writers who are writing in every different style. And what's interesting to me about the idea of culture and language is, you know, culture does not exist in language only topically, only in terms of subject matter. But it's interesting to try to articulate where culture resides. If it's not sort of in a statement of a place or a statement of a story that we can identify as being ethnic, then how does it reside in language? It's word choice, diction perhaps, it's music and rhythm in the poems. But it's a question to me, you know, sort of how we define that, or if we need to define it. Because I am mestiza, Latina, whatever the term you want to use, I feel that very powerfully. I felt it all of my life. And so to me, an interesting thing that happened to me is when my first book came out, I gave a reading, I can't even remember where it was, and at the end of the reading somebody said, "How is this Latino poetry?" And I said, "Excuse me?" And they said, "This is nothing like the Latino poetry that I know." And I said, "Because it comes out of my body, and because that's my heritage and my culture." But that question from the audience has always stayed with me, and it's become an important question now as this field opens up, because some people would say that there are some young Latino poets who are sort of writing in the language poetry tradition of the late 20th century, and so they'll say, well, this doesn't, you know, there's no culture in this, it's just language, it's just sort of American. And so it raises that question for me. First of all, I think it's a bad idea to feel impelled to write any particular way as a poet, because it has to be identified a certain way. So I think we just write what we write, but it is, for me, a very provocative question.
And would you then say that it is actually inimical to poetry to politicize culture in this way?
Mm-hmm.
Well, if you're not writing about a particular aspect of being a Chicana that has to do with food, religion, family, then you're obviously not Chicana.
Right.
And you would counter, but you are politicizing culture. Culturally, culture is much more diffused in the world.
Absolutely. And I think what's so interesting about the States is that, you know, the diaspora of Latino poetry, I mean, it's so broad. We have Cuban Americans, Puerto Rican Americans, Hispanic, if you call it, Mexican Americans, those who would call themselves Chicano, Honduran American. I mean, do we expect that poetry is all going to be the same? It just couldn't possibly be. And also within that, our experiences are vastly different. My particular life is very different, you know, than somebody else's who lives grew up in an urban area who's Puerto Rican American. So the idea of in any way codifying what Latino poetry should be is a kind of ridiculous idea to me. That said, I'm still very interested in how culture manifests itself in literature beyond the ways that people have been thinking about it for the most part. And I think there is a conversation about this, or the development of conversation about this, whenever I meet Latino poets and talk with them or hear their work. And I think I love the conversation. I don't have an answer, but I suspect it's all of these things. I suspect that that the rhythm that I write with in some ways is sort of deeply embedded in the body that, you know, I've had since I was a child, and that body grew up in an atmosphere where culture, my own identity and culture was very important, so that in some ways those they're not even less obvious, but the things that we don't think of right away are embedded in the work. And so it makes me think about other, whether regional literatures or ethnic literatures as well. I mean, when we read the work of Black writers, how do we recognize Blackness in that? How do we recognize Asianness? And I think that we need to think outside of the box in that all of us have been trained to think about so-called ethnic literature in a certain way, and now we can think about it, I think, in a more broad way, and that's kind of a fascinating undertaking for me as I read other people's work.
And there's, I suspect, surely an important difference between how blacks recognize blackness and how whites recognize blackness.
Yeah, absolutely.
And they compete in the marketplace, I would suspect.
Absolutely. I mean, I think that, yes, what happened in the second half of the 20th century with postmodernism is we had this opening to sort of ethnic literature, women's literature, as well as others. But I think what happened is that in some ways publishers decided what, you know, how that ethnicity manifested itself in the poems and validated certain kinds of manifestations. And now, in the 21st century, that's opening up and it's becoming more difficult for everybody. So, for example, my second book, published by University of Arizona Press, a wonderful press, but it is put in the in a particular series. They're a Latino series, and there's a Native American series, and I have problems with that. I have problems with that. On the one hand, I think it helps people say, okay, this is where I can find books by Latino poets. But I'm not sure what that means, really. Does it mean that the audience for that series is looking for a particular manifestation there? And why is it separate from their general books of poetry? I mean, to me, this sort of question or codifying or expectation about what the poetry should be affects the publishing industry, it affects the reading public. And I don't think there are easy answers on either side. I mean, is it good to have a Latino series at a university press? I don't know. I think there are advantages to it, and I think there are disadvantages to it. Will people start to think that all the poetry is the same? And what does that mean? Does that mean that in some ways that we've all assimilated to the point where we can't recognize culture in our work? And that might be actually true of some of the lives of persons of color in this country. I mean, sometimes I will encounter students of color who say, well, I'm just American. I don't want to identify myself as whatever it is, Black, Hispanic, Latino, Chicano, whatever. And so I just think that in a country that is the melting pot and where issues of assimilation and sort of guarding of one culture are very fluid and very complex and very diverse, that the way these issues affect literature is also sort of complex and mystifying and frustrating and very interesting all at once.
That's indeed a wonderful answer to a complex question, and your answer does point to this tension that exists between the creative act and then the reception of that creative act. And the poet is reconciled to the world, but not necessarily happily.
Yes, that's true.
Well, I would like to ask you some other questions that you have not addressed exactly, perhaps in a broad way. And this one is as follows. I am sure you have been asked this question at job interviews. And maybe it is not the fairest of all questions, but might you define your poetics in one sentence?
I think that's impossible to do.
Is that your answer, that it's impossible?
I think it's impossible to do that. I think any answer to a question that I give is always, takes much too long to answer. It's too complex to do that. My poetics are to continue to evolve as a poet. I think I'll just say that. I need to keep moving forward. And that means, so this is the long answer, I read everything. I'm open to poetry movements everywhere, within the Latino community and in American poetry in general. I challenge myself with each book to push the boundaries of what my own work does. My poetry, it is both, it's important for my poetry to mean something, and it's important for my poetry to be rigorous on the level of language. And so meaning is important to me, and that's a response in some ways to some of the postmodern movements. At the same time, I've taken a lot of inspiration from, let's say, the language poetry movements and other poetry movements of the second half of the 20th century that have challenged my way of thinking about poetry. I want to keep my poetry rigorous. I want it to mean something. I want it to be true to my experience of the world.
Your answer actually is an answer to my question, in the sense that you are arguing that an epigrammatic answer is unfair to poetry, and that a discursive one is much more accurate, so that Pound's idea that good poetry is news that stays news is it's memorable, but not exactly the best answer that one can provide. And there's a great deal of, how shall I put it, there's a very strong liking by people for this kind of pithy answer that can be memorized. Let me ask you this follow-up. Some years ago, I included your poems, 4 or 5, I don't remember, in my anthology, Renaming Ecstasy, Latino Writings on the Sacred. Do you perceive yourself as a poet of the sacred, and what does this term mean for you?
I would say yes, that I perceive myself as that. I remember I was reading in Las Cruces, this was many years ago, and the poet Tony Hoagland wrote an introduction for me that said that my poems were modern prayers. And I've always remembered that, and I remember liking that phrase, that they, the poems, almost all of them are kinds of invocations. And whether they're invocations to the dead, whether they're invocations to another world. I always say that I would describe my poems as trying to navigate the boundaries between the visible and invisible worlds. And so that to me is what sacred is. I'm not practicing Catholic anymore, but I sort of believe in I love religious ritual of all kinds. I sort of love the best of religion, and I abhor the worst of what religions have done to the world historically. But I would say for me, the sacred lies in a kind of interest in the borders between visible and invisible worlds.
This question ties in with your answer on the sacred. Do you have any rituals for preparing to write?
My best answer is vacuuming. Actually works really well for me. I need blank space before I write. So if I'm very lucky, that's sleep, and I can get up early enough before my family gets up and things start to happen around the house. But as I get older, and I have more things happening and going on, it's very hard to do that. So sometimes vacuuming helps, because vacuuming is a kind of blankness. So anything that clears my mind prepares me to write. And when I write, when I'm writing at my best, I blank out. So I am not present. This echoes back to other things I've said, I think. So oftentimes I will go somewhere, and then when I come to, the poem is on the page, or parts of the poem are on the page. So there's something about blankness or emptiness or absence, which is part of the title of my first book, that prepares me to write. I cannot write poetry after I've spent a day teaching or dealing with a lot of people. I just can't, I don't write late at night for that reason. I'm usually exhausted and I've had too many things enter my head. So morning's the best time, or after any activity that allows me to not be thinking.
Do you keep a schedule then, that every morning you wake up prepared, or at least willing to prepare yourself to write?
I used to be much better about that. I think now my life is much more complicated, especially because I moved back to my home state, which is a great thing, and I have a big family, and I'm married now. I was single for most of my life until just 2 years ago I got married, and now we've become sort of guardians and foster parents to my niece, and so that my schedule has gone completely out the window. So I used to be very good about that, but now, whenever I can get it done, summers are good because people go off to work or off to school and I have some quiet time, but no, life's complicated, and so I yearn back for those days, but I don't have them anymore.
Would you say that, yes, you did have that freedom before, but now you have a different kind of comfort?
Oh yes, my life's much more balanced now. I get a lot less writing done, but I have a much more balanced life. And I must say, perhaps the reason why this third book in some ways does remain in more real places is because my life has changed this way. So I think the evolution of my work, and I do think this third book-length poem is an evolution, may be in fact because the circumstances of my life have changed. And even though I've yearned for the past, in those first two books, again, the poems were escaped to imaginary worlds. Of course, they were grounded in this world, but for the most part, and maybe that's because I was able to have that time in the morning. I was able to achieve that, and now that my life's more complicated, and in fact, it is affecting the poems, and that's a good thing. And so I'm sure I'll find a routine. I think my life's just been in a transition for the last few years because of a lot of major life events that have happened, and that's affecting the work. So I do believe, I'm never going to stop writing. It's too absolutely central to who I am. So in some ways, I should just, when I yearn for those years, maybe I should just really sort of feel the comfort that my life is unfolding the way it should be. I do believe that, and that the work is unfolding as well because of that.
Well, might you also say that even though you have less time now, the time that you have is so precious that you cannot waste it?
That's true.
You have to be very productive.
Yes, and I write in spurts. I think that's been more true in the last few years. I have sort of intense periods, and then I won't write, or I'll write on breaks. But as soon as I say that, I realize that that's not true, because this third book, I went to a theater performance by the Latino Dance Project, and the first part was a dance narrative about the women of Juarez, and I don't remember anything after that. I don't remember the rest of the performance, though I was sitting there with my husband watching it. The next day I started writing, and I had about the first 30 sections within about maybe a month. And when people say, well, when did you write? I can't even tell you. I couldn't tell you what time I wrote those sections. I don't remember if it was in the morning. I don't know. I mean, I just did the work. And so there is no routine now. Now I think whenever I get that feeling, it's not even like, well, then I have to sit down and write. It's like I just do it. The work just happens, and I don't really have a clear memory, because my experience of writing when I'm intensely engaged is, it's again this kind of place where it's hard to remember. I can't remember where I am while I'm writing, and now I can't even remember when I did the work.
Well, would you say then that your vocation now is perhaps more integrated with the ebb and flow of domestic life?
I suppose so, but I mean, I always feel like there's not enough time for writing, so maybe that's the reality of it, but I'm always sort of thinking that I haven't integrated my writing life so well into my more complex domestic life. So I'm still writing. That's what's amazing to me. I mean, I guess in some ways when I think about the tumultuousness of my life in all the best ways in the last few years, that I tend to sort of think, oh, I'm not writing at all, and in fact I've really finished another book, so it's a mystery. It happened, but I'm not sure how.
Your answer speaks to the wrongness of the myths that even that young people have of the poet as a bohemian, as a counterculture figure, and in fact, poets are just people with lives like anybody else who happen to have the craft of writing poetry.
Oh, I agree, and I talk to my students a lot about that. I mean, my life has been a journey of healing. If I had bought into the self-destructive artist, that would have been the absolutely worst thing I could have done for myself, because I wouldn't be here now, I think. And though, like many other young people, as a young writer, I sort of had my wild phases and experimented a lot, but for the most part, my life has been a journey of healing. And my teacher and mentor, Jane Miller at the University of Arizona, this is along with Joy Harjo and some others, she used to say that to us a lot. She'd say, we'd come into class, looking like hell as graduate students, I'm sure, and she would say, herbs and vitamins, everybody, herbs and vitamins. And we'd laugh. And she'd encourage us not to buy into that legend, that stereotype. And I also think as a woman, that's a very important sort of stereotype not to buy into, because I think for the most part it's male, and there were wives there who were cleaning up after those writers and taking care of the home. And the reality is that, in this world, if you want to keep writing, you have to take care of those things all for ourselves. And another thing is, I think that, there's an undervaluing, I think, of family life in that stereotype, that somehow you have to be this crazy sort of perhaps unfaithful, perhaps violent spouse. And it's just really not a good thing to take into ourselves, because the fact of the matter is that, our legacy as writers is, I have never considered it my only legacy, the books that I leave behind. What I leave behind in this world, more importantly, is my relationships in my family, in my community, in my neighborhood. It's wonderful that I will have books left after me when I die. And it's wonderful if people consider those books well. But what matters to me most is what we leave behind in terms of the people around us. And I think that we can forget that in that those stories of the tortured artists who we love, whether painters or writers. I think that's, they're fascinating stories. I think they're dangerous models to live. And for me, healing is the reason why I'm here, and I will never undervalue that life. And the gifts that I bring to the world are just as important to me as my books, the community work that I do, the work, again, within, the close-knit circle of our family and friends. Those are the people who are going to remember me most powerfully in this world. And so that keeps me centered as I get older.
And how these tortured, unseemly lives that we find so, most people find so delectable to read about,
Absolutely.
Because of their prurience. They resemble, in a sense, hagiographies in their own way, anti-hagiographies.
Yeah.
Instead of reading about an exemplary life, you read about a horrendous life.
Right.
And that is perhaps equally pleasurable to some. But if you value your poems more than you do your own children,
Absolutely.
You've got a big problem.
Very big problem. Yeah. And that's not the way the universe in some ways is meant to be considered, though the stories that depart from that may be, as you say, sensational and sort of delectable, but they're not models to live by.
No, not at all. And I think that in America right now we have a preponderance of poets who are just regular people in many ways, who take on an unusual voice on the page.
And to me, that tension is a very important one. In fact, perhaps if we call our lives ordinary on the one hand, that perhaps it enables the extraordinary imagination on another. I mean, I think one of the problems with the sort of tortured artistic life is in some ways it's excess in both ways. It's excess in terms of the life. It may be excess in terms of imagination. And that's great, but I'm always talking with my students about tension in the poems and how, opposing elements and opposing forces give the poem its vitality in many ways. Well, that's modeled in our lives as well. It should be modeled. There should be a tension in our lives. So the ordinariness of my life, and I must say that I've been more ordinary in the past sort of 5 or 6 years than ever. I've had a very tumultuous life in many ways and a very interesting life, but the kind of balance that I've achieved in the last few years has not prevented me from writing, so that's a revelation on my part.
And we are indeed lucky to have the time to write,
Yes.
as opposed to most people who, even if they had the inclination, would not have the time.
Absolutely, and I think about that a lot. I think about the voices that we don't hear because making a living and all those things. I mean, there are poets, writers, voices out there who are silent simply because they don't have the luxury that I really have in my life to have even a few moments, even an hour during the day. So with all my sort of domestic and familial responsibilities now, you're right. I mean, there are people in this world who do not have the leisure to write, and I think it's important to remember that. I mean, the idea of a tortured life in some ways, in the contemporary world, you have to have a kind of privilege in order to do that. Most people are trying to make enough money to support their families. Sort of sobering in the best way things to have in mind.
And with this privilege, if we can call it that, also comes the responsibility not to squander it.
Yes.
And you are a teacher, and teaching and writing are certainly important to you.
Mm-hmm.
And how you negotiate between your teaching duties and the time to write, plus your familial, domestic responsibilities, must surely be an object of struggle, maybe, or preoccupation every single day.
Yeah, I think that's true, and I also do a lot of community work. I'm a member of an artist-run organization called Little Globe, and we actually work in communities, underserved communities, and we create collaboratively with diverse communities. So the last project that we did was called Memory Lines, and we worked with 18 members of the community, very diverse, from ages 8 through 88, in which we created an opera. It was sponsored by the Santa Fe Opera, and this work is very important to me. I've always done a lot of community work as an individual artist, but with Little Globe now, this incredible process that we undertake with communities of bringing people together and creating a kind of performance or installation. And so my life is very, very busy with all of these things and often unmanageable. And so I'm often trying to think about how I can scale down. I love to teach. Do I stop teaching? I'll never stop writing. I can't stop taking care of my family. There's no way that I could sort of eliminate my community work because it's just something that's very dear to my heart. It feeds me, it transforms me, it keeps me moving forward as an artist, and it keeps me in a place where I feel that my life has most of its value. And so, yes, my life is unmanageable. And even when I look at my own resume or CV, there are times when I think, how long can you go on this way? And so as I get older, I'm making certain changes in my life. So those things are important. I think that teaching and writing, now I think of that as sort of luxurious if I were only doing those two things. But I love being in the classroom for the most part. I love a lot of things. I do a lot of things. I'm a poet, primarily, but I write essays. I'm a playwright. I do other creative arts. I am, I'm just sort of, in terms of an artist, I'm sort of multidisciplinary, and that's how I've always been, and it's even more so as I get older. And so I have a very vibrant life as an artist, which includes teaching, which includes all this other stuff. But it's too much. But I manage it as best I can, and try to take care of myself and everybody else. And sometimes I'm successful.
Your answer, your eloquent answer, points out how the poetic vocation doesn't necessarily exist in isolation, but exists in tandem with other life activities, taking care of family, or community work, or teaching, or more overt religious activities, perhaps. Or what if someone is a poet but also a chef?
Oh, yeah.
How does being a chef inform the poetry, and how does poetry inform the cooking as well? I mean,
absolutely, and I think we need more chef poets. I really, I think what's happened to poetry is that a lot of poets have sort of found themselves in academic institutions, and that's fine. But I think that in some ways that's also becoming codified in this country, and that's a danger. That's a danger, because I think that in some ways institutions, and I've belonged to them as a teacher for many, many years, but we need to be careful about that, because they are institutions, and they are Western institutions. They're European in their origin, and we have to be careful to validate poets who exist outside of those institutions. And so, this is a subject in contemporary poetry that we talk about too. I mean, there's critiques of creative writing programs and MFA programs for that reason, that in fact that we're churning out a lot of mediocre poets in a lot of these programs, because they're all flocking to these MFA majors. And I just think that there's something to that. As much as I've enjoyed what is, 16 or 17 years teaching at the college level, I do want to, that's important to me, that in some ways the poetry community should also be supporting, whatever that means, poets who are working outside academia. We are all one community, and I don't, just this morning I was talking to somebody and they were saying, sort of belonging to the club, and she was meaning the club of sort of poets, are able to get university jobs. We all need to make a living, that's important, but we need those chef poets, we need those factory worker poets. They are voices that are crucial.
Well, to extend your answer and to finalize the interview, I would say that students, MFA graduates, often have the sense that, well, a teaching job is a reward for being a good poet. But in fact, a teaching job just means that you are a teacher.
Right.
And that is the way that you will make your living, and you like to teach because of the teaching itself, not because of what the teaching provides.
Right.
And in fact, someone who is a teacher would teach anyone, anywhere, not necessarily in a university.
I agree, and I just think that the life of a poet these days can be a creative endeavor. How a poet engages with the world or disengages with the world depends. I'm teaching Emily Dickinson. One of my special areas is 19th century American literature. I wrote my undergraduate thesis on Thoreau, and so I love the 19th century American writers, and I love Emily Dickinson. And though she disengaged from the world, and in some ways I never mean to critique that, I just think that the poet's life in the contemporary worlds can be very different depending on the person, and that we should allow for that and validate that, and that in some ways, something that I've been emphasizing, I think, in this interview, that I do think about my life as a poet not only as a poet's life, but as a life. And of course, poetry, I would say, is at the center of who I am. But my life, in some ways, has many other elements to it. And how poetry, it's wonderful if poetry participates in the other important areas of my life in an integrated way. And that's what I'm trying to achieve. So that working with the community, for me, that's a creative collaboration. And my relationship with my family, in some ways, in some ways, they circle around and move through my creative life. They're part of that. And so for me, it's about integrating it. And if teaching is part of that, great. If I decided to quit teaching and just work at the local coffee shop, in some ways I'd like for us to be able to consider that part of the poet's life, part of the creative life. And so for me, it's about living an integrated life and learning how to do that. I have not achieved that, but I'm learning how to do that. It's becoming more clear to me as I get older that that's the kind of life I want to have, a kind of whole life where poetry is, I guess, at the center, but more important, poetry participates in all the aspects of my life in a positive way, in an integrated way.
Well, this interview concludes, and I would like to thank Valerie very much for being so
welcome.
generous and so engaged with these questions.
Thank you.
Have a good day, good reading.
Thank you. So nice to meet you.